Ah, Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of Dr. Phil Reads to Write. Today, I would like to look at the poetics of place. How best to write place? There is a wonderful tradition, especially in lyric poetry, I think, of the poem in praise of the natural world. The poem in praise of a particularly beautiful or scenic place in nature, a location in nature, or of a moment spent with wild flora and fauna. And this is a wonderful reassurance of poetry, a poetry that is designed really to make us feel at whole, at peace with the natural world around us. It's a very good poem or poetry to read, isn't it, in terms of our own mental health. And I think this type of poetry can be very conservative and traditional, but it has its place. It's a poetry that I love to read, for example. And I think coming from a religious background, coming from a religious tradition, it is very tempting, isn't it, to see the world around us, the natural world, as creation. And of course, if we live within creation, it just sort of makes sense that there is a creator. And, for most of us, even if we don't want an all-powerful creator, most of us want an all-loving creator. And so again, this poetry or this poetics of place can feed into these types of narratives. And I think the poet, when they're writing their own place poetry, has to be aware of these resonances and work out what it is that they are trying to do, trying to achieve, what impact they want on the reader of their poetry of place. Because it's interesting, isn't it, that on the one sense, on the one hand, we do have this wonderful poetry that is reassuring, that is full of resplendent beauty, moments of great transcendent beauty. And it's wonderful to be moved out of ourselves, to feel at one, at whole with the universe even. But there are also other scientists, aren't there, like Richard Dawkins, who would remind us that, this world that so many of us see as a thing of great beauty, of reassuring beauty. Dawkins would remind us that this is exactly the world you would expect to live in if, of course, there was no creator. If, in fact, nobody was up there pulling the levers. This is a universe where suffering is almost the normal situation for most wild animals and plants. It's very sobering, isn't it, to remember that of all the wild animals that die, what percentage is it of those that have died because they were literally eaten alive? And suffering is such a natural part of this beauty, this wonderful, resplendent nature that we often live within. We go to great gardens, don't we? And we look at all the beautiful walls and, that lovely beauty, the secluded peacefulness of the walled garden. But, that's not really what nature is all about. On the other hand, you also have, as Tennyson said, of course, nature red in tooth and claw. And so I think in developing our own poetics of place, I think it's probably important to try and hold in place this tension, this different way of looking, experiencing the beautiful natural world around us. Yes, there is a thing of beauty out there. We can be reassured by that wonderful blue sky. We can feel a sense of connectedness with the flora and fauna that we can live within, even if it is for a transitory, momentary time. But we need to also be aware of the scientific way of looking at the natural world. It's not all just resplendent beauty. There is also the crocodile, the ambush hunter. And, we can think, can't we, of the heron or the ibis or spoonbill, any of those beautiful wading birds. We can write of these beautiful birds, these great, elegant birds, striding, wading through the shallows, maybe amidst all that beautiful water lily with the blue sky and the sun shining. And it can be a moment of great beauty, and it's very easy to see these wading birds as being a little bit akin to the Tai Chi exponent, and in reality, these birds are not having a moment of reposed calm, of meditation. There's not that centeredness there, really. These birds are there for the kill. And what they're doing is actually living in their in their particular niche, in their ecological niche, and they're living very successfully. That is the triumph of evolution, isn't it? And I think when we develop this praise poetry of place, we really do need to hold in tension these different ways of being with and looking at, experiencing the beauty of the natural world around us. There is great resplendent beauty, but there is also the nature red in tooth and claw. And that tension, that juxtaposition, I think, to be honest, in the 21st century, it really needs to be built into the architecture of this wonderful praise poetry when we have a go at writing it. In Australia, there's like in most countries, I suspect, there is a wonderful tradition of the poetry of play. There is a wonderful tradition of this exact sort of thing that we're just talking about, of the praise poetry. One of my favourite poets of the natural world in Australia is a wonderful poet called Judith Beveridge. She's a Sydney poet. She has spent quite a few years, I think, working as a professor of creative writing at the University of Sydney. And she's a wonderful, generous, very, very reassuring, very popular poet. This is a book that she's written, Sun Music, New and Selected Poems. And I think that wonderful title, Sun Music, gives you a way into this book, isn't it? This is a book that's going to be in praise of the natural world, of walking under the rays of that sun. And there is just poem after poem in this book that, it just makes you feel fantastic to be alive sometimes, to be able to witness such poetry. This is one poem in this book. This is a poem called River Music. The mouth of a little fish had just sipped away a star from the river. A lyrebird was opening the day, volunteering to be a bell. We were watching an egret prod at the nutrient dark, its beak one tin of a fork catching what floats. Just as the sun began cracking the trees awake, the bird's song reached us. Then it sharded into the river's cold glass. You thought you heard it again in the eddying backwash. A frog began to ratchet, self-correcting like a clock. Our boat swung away on the revolutions of its propeller. Water adjusted its slap, displacing sound in the cutaway rock. And then the egret stepped into a sun shaft. A crow flew down, made its lane in the spirit human sound. Cicadas drummed hard against a sky turning cold, vitrified. Wind came, then the rain. Then the wind dropped into the reeds. Thought you said it was the bird again, and its sly alarm. We found hooks enough to load our lines. Let our reels click the hours away with the quick flicking of our casts. I heard a bird fly into the pin oaks, the swamp gums, then into the torpulas with barely a sound. All the way home I turned the oars hard, making a round music with my arms. Just like we saw in that last episode on A.R. Ammons, that wonderful last line he had to bring that beautiful, long, rambling poem to a conclusion. I love the way Judy Beveridge brings this poem to a conclusion with that wonderful return to the eye, to the person whose, literally eye we are seeing the poem through, and to her movement through that space in that little rowboat. And the fact also that, this is a poem of incredible beauty, isn't it? Of transcendent natural beauty, of a moment spent on the river. But it is also a poem, as she says in that last stanza, where we had hooks enough to load our lines. This is a poem that has a barb to it. This is another poem by Judy Beveridge. Morning up river. At times, You can hear the slow seep of the gases, or the sweet, decomposing twitter of a scrub wren, or a mopox, 2 notes pumping like an oar beat across the bay. If you wait, you can see the quarter moon break through the mist, or through cool, interleaving rain. You wouldn't think it would be beautiful in the cold, scratched light, insects circling before they set off towards a day's smear of blood. I come here often, sometimes just to listen to the chug of a punt, or to see a swamp harrier land on a sagging branch. Sometimes a chat will fly low into the reeds, or an egret step high among the eelgrass before it shifts its reflection into the shallows, or across the sliding slosh of a ripple. When the mist lifts, I wait for king parrots to call, bright as this river's glint, as the light in a flooded gum. I row into the shadows of a saltwater paperbark as branches stir the brackish wash. I think of my trip back down, and I rock in my silver skiff. Oh, I just love Judy Beveridge, one of my favourite Australian poets. Here's another wonderful Australian poet. I don't know how many people nowadays are familiar or really read Vivian Smith. Vivian Smith was another guy. He was a professor or reader of Australian literature at the University of Sydney for many times. He was originally a Hobart boy, and he's written some beautiful poetry of place, really in praise of Hobart and trying to set up a relationship, a communication between himself as now a visitor to Hobart and memories of place and culture and natural world, and they're beautiful poems. I thought today though I might read a couple of poems from this book that are really set more in his adult life, which he lived nearly his whole adult life in Sydney. This is a beautiful book. It's called Along the Line, and like with the Judy Beveridge, you can really get a sense, can't you, that this is a poet that's going to be very attuned to the natural world, to the walk, the ramble of a life through the natural world, along the line. It's a beautiful title, I think, for a collection like this. Here's one poem by Vivian Smith from this book, Despite the Room. Into this cave of night, darkness, and the sleepless tide room, despite my mind, the heavy blind, the sudden song of birds will come to draw me out into the light, to walk the path and feel the day, surround me with its cool and green dew, saying all it has to say. In drops that glance along the leaf, or in the rose, asleep, unfurled, the patient strictness of the dew, the slow intactness of the world. Oh, what a beautiful last line to just hint at beauty, at wholeness. You know, we can so often have such fractured, such vulnerability in our psychic headspace, and this is a wonderful poem, isn't it? Despite the room. You know, it gives us room to feel good. Here's another poem by Vivian Smith. Early Arrival, Sydney. Red cockatoo crests caught on coral trees, my Sydney emblems. Dragging the land in view, our ship hauls glass and concrete to its side as gully flies up and snatch and scream and glide away on a sea smeared with a trace of blue. The neon flicker and the skyline wakes. The orange suburbs float through miles of calm. A pastel-coloured terrace shades its slope, while 5 gulls fight for nothing on a rope. The breeze picks out a single listless palm. The city's like a room far under sea, with locked arcades, with shadow waves subside. Grey windows bend great cloud shapes as they pass beyond these tiles, tunnels iron, glass, the flat waters of green inlets ride where all the folded yachts are chained away. But here the huge hotels still sway in space with the exactness of a foreign place. Isn't it wonderful having those moments of nature, of repose in the midst of the city? You know, just a wonderful reminder that the wonderful poem in praise of the natural world can exist in that urban, suburban space. It's beautiful poetry, isn't it? Here's another poet who perhaps isn't read as much as he should be today. This is one of my favourite Australian poets. This is a guy called R.F. Brissenden, who died quite a long while ago. This is the oldest of the poets I'm going to read today. I think Brissenden was sort of a mid-late 20th century poet from New South Wales, the ACT predominantly. And he really, in many ways, was there right at the beginning of really starting to develop a more post-colonial poetic ethic, particularly in the way that he wrote place. So he's a really interesting sort of poet for many ways. But, you know, while being attuned to that post-colonial poetic, he is also very attuned to living at one with the natural world. And he's a wonderful poet who gets at an ecological sensibility and who really, like Judy Beveridge and Vivian Smith, can make us give that wonderful transcendent sense of being whole with the natural world. Here's an unexpected poem called Rabbiting. You know, we might think this is going to be a lot more about bloodshed and about hunting, but let's see where the poem takes us. Rabbiting by R.F. Brissenden. Nobody lives in the valley anymore. The fox cries and the granite boulder cracks unheard in the frosty night, and the long light of yellow afternoons washes unseen across grey stone and ringbark trees to spill down eroded red gullies. Sometimes a boy in autumn breaks the quiet with a shot and then forgets his rabbit as he stands listening to the distant call of birds. Drift back into that pool of windless air. Belts of dead thistles higher than his face stand razor spike between him and the stone chimney and the crumbled roofless walls of clay that glow clear orange in the flat late sun. If now he turns and pushes through the thistles, he will find beyond the house a vagrant orchard. On the broken trees of rotting in the grass, there may be fruit, apples, bitter quinces, woody pears, sweet nectarines pecked to pieces by the birds, and the pale, soft loquats. On one tree, he knows small plums in dusky blue tight bunches hang along the branches, silver now against the fading sky. Under his fingers, they will feel heavy, alive, and hard. The skin become black-purple beneath its bloom, and as he bites into the tart, clean flesh, he wonders why sour fruit should taste so good, and who they were who built the house and planted all those trees. Such an unexpected poem, isn't it? Particularly the ending. I'll never forget the first time I read this poem. This is a poem called Birds About the House. This is a little bit smaller. This isn't, bushwalking in an old orchard that might have been discovered in what is now a national park, like in the previous poem. This is much more set in that suburban space, in the suburban backyard, and of the great beauty that we can have in that small, intimate space. Birds About the House, one of my favourites. That year, it was the whipbirds we noticed most. All day the forest rang with the male birds' brilliant, drawn-out whistling lash and their concerts echoing song. Lovers and friends from the house, we'd watch them move quick through the dappling shade of burrowing fronds, thick grass and underbrush, shy couples but unafraid. 10 years have passed, and those who were with us then are scattered now. One dead. That was beautiful. One rich, one lost. The lovers long ago have fled into their storm. But round our house new birds have come. Currawongs eat our bread, and kookaburras bring their young to take our scraps of meat. Bright parrots flash through wind-stirred branch and leaf like fish through swaying reed. And bowerbirds, bronze and dark metallic blue, flutter to hop and feed about our sawn log table. And today, by some unguessed-for chance, most timid of all, high-stepping and alone, a lyrebird came to dance, or play, at least to reach or touch somehow the elusive mate he'd found reflected in our windows. So with tail flaunted and the mimic sound of every other bird he wooed his own faint image in the glass, until he heard us move. Then, as he ran, I thought how summers pass, and how the whipbirds came, and how, although their song, as it did then, still rings beneath the trees, we have not seen the shy whipbirds again. It's just a poem of great beauty, isn't it, in praise of wild birds, of those visitors who come and bless our daily routines. But in praising nature, in praising these wild birds, there is that sadness in the poem, isn't there, of time passing, of time lost, of maybe even the encroachment of suburban sprawl. And why haven't the whipbirds come again? Is it because of suburban sprawl, deforestation? There is a transitory beauty to this particular poem that I really love. It's one of the things that R.F. Brissenden, to my ear and eye, really captures well. Here's another beautiful poem by Brissenden. This one is called, I love the understated irony of this title, Seeing is Believing. Clear morning after rain, first light on fresh leaf, tip and flower, and on the naked limbs of spotted gum, beyond them the wide bay, cups like an abalone shell, the hushed Pacific, the air is still, one last star fades, a magpie calls, his tentative, pure song blends with the murmur of the reef to wake the world. Oh, it is easy to see what they were looking for. The wine and roses boys, unfallen Eve falling at last at Newport, Pan at Lane Cove, and horny Venus romping through the springwood scrub. It won't work today. Our Eden is scarred and a harrowed stubble of dead trees. No nymphs or shepherds haunt its clear-felled glades. Arcadian dawns are gentler than ours. The light is dying. Cat paws stroke the water the wrong way, and the fisherman's curse, the black nor'easter, soon will chop the bay with white caps. But the world is quiet. Raindrops poise unnumbered galaxies on spider webs and crimson bottle brushes, while on sanded floors of rock pools, small blue shells inscribe their hieroglyphs. Kneeling, we try to read their message. Mica flecks in sandstone flash under the myriad feet of ants, and the sun burns on the currawong's tearing beak and in his yellow eye. Seeing is believing. That's a wonderful poem of juxtaposition, isn't it? Of, on the one hand, in praise of the natural world again, of those wild visitations with flora and fauna. But it is also, there's a real sense in that poem of nature also disrupted, of nature disappearing in front of our eyes with urban and suburban sprawl and deforestation. And there is a wonderful sense of the transitory beauty in this poem, and of maybe the way that we're not necessarily always dwelling very well in this place. And that needs to be part of our poetry of place, doesn't it? There is that sense, that ecological sense of the damage that we are doing. It's all very well to go and visit a beautiful botanical gardens or something, and to write the great poem, or to row up the river and to write another poem in praise of this moment of beauty. But we really do, from a political sense, need to keep in mind the damage we are doing. And I think R.F. Brissenden does that really well. He also has some, as I said, some beautiful poems, really beginning in Australian poetry, that post-colonial sensibility of doing honour to the first Australians whose custodianship of this land, of course, continues and has been here for millennia. And R.F. Brissenden was probably one of our first poets to really begin this exploration of what it might mean for a European person to be more attuned to first Australians and to the custodianship of them. Now, of course, in any poetics of place, if you're going to look at Australian poets, Judy Beveridge, R.F. Brissenden, Vivian Smith, they're all fabulous. But you could not write a poetics of place without looking at Robert Adamson. Robert Adamson is a very well-known Australian contemporary poet. Unfortunately, he's just recently passed away. He was a wonderful poet who lived most of his adult life and also his young life on the Hawkesbury River, just north of Sydney. And he wrote many poems in praise of the river. And he had a long family tradition of oyster farmers and fishermen and this sort of thing, or fisher folk, sorry. This is a wonderful selected poems by Robert Adamson called Reading the River, which is a wonderful title, isn't it? If we could write poems that literally could read that river, just like we can read through turning the pages of a book. It's a wonderful title, I think. Here's one poem in this selected. This is a poem for his partner Juno. Juno was a lovely photographer who took many photos for Robert Adamson. She took this photo on the front cover of this particular book, of course. Juno's also famous for producing photographs of Australian writers, particularly poets and painters. She did a lot of work, for example, with Brett Whiteley before he passed away. So here's a poem by Robert Adamson called Couplets. And it's a poem that's written in couplets. This is really interesting, actually. All the poetry I'm reading today, we really do have the finely wrought urn in these poems. These are poems that do have a real regularity of line length. There's not necessarily any rhyme or even half rhyme going on, but there is a real sense of form with stanza shape and with line length. And there's a lot of alliteration, a lot of beautiful metaphorical language. So it's interesting that this poetics of place does often bring out, I suppose, a more traditional sense of form in poetry. So this is a poem, a wonderful poem called Couples, written to his partner of many years, Juno. So the poem, appropriately, is written in couplets. It's beautiful. On days still, when the tide's full, river hours with you, a momentary fire in the head, shall not stay memories even so intensely lived, just to sense bay calm and watch the seconds scatter. These cupped hands of brackish water evaporate as light fragments in her hair flicker with mangrove shade for your skin. I know grass banks where we strolled together on the shaggy cotton bush. Now remember not to remember any day other than our morning on Jerusalem Bay. Bay, there as tide turned the stern, our boat was afloat on a mist, rolling in, full of the song of the wattle bird. You can't get a much better poem than that, can you? In praise of a moment spent in wholeness, in the beauty of the resplendent beauty of the natural world, but also tinged with that wonderful romantic sensibility of a couple being alone in this incredibly moving place on the Hawkesbury River. Such a wonderful poet. Here's another book by Robert Adamson. This is probably my favourite individual book by Robert Adamson, The Goldfinches of Bagdad. Another great title, isn't it? A great sense of drama and mystery. You know, what are these goldfinches of Bagdad? And it's got a magnificent cover. It's a beautiful artwork on the cover. This is probably my favourite individual book by Robert Adamson. I was lucky enough to meet Robert a couple of times at the Sydney Writers' Festival, and he signed both of these books for me. So I'm really pleased to have these two books and to have them signed for me by Robert Adamson. Here's a wonderful poem called Winter Night, and it's dedicated to another Australian poet called Kevin Hart, who was as well as being a wonderful poet, he's a philosopher theologian. He spent a lot of time, I think, in the Catholic university system in the United States. I'm not sure where Kevin is now. He's a wonderful poet. So this is a poem, Winter Night, and it's dedicated to Kevin Hart. In the darkness beyond our garden fence, a white-tailed water rat. Our cat crouches in ambush in the mango tree. Down below, an amateur fisherman flicks a lure at racks of oysters near the shore, then gives up and takes a swig of whiskey. Ah, the way that first drink braces. A motorboat roars by, no lights. The black river swallows it, leaving behind a swirl of fumes. The surface reflects the glow from our house and the chuckling call of a nightjar. Stars fracture in the sky with light. The cat keeps playing with weird marsupials. The hook wound in my finger stings like hell. As I come up from the wharf, a flying fox rattles in the banana palms. I hear the long whisper of its beating wings. Follow me up the stairs. The stars flicker, letters from a dead god's alphabet. Wow, there's mystery in that last line, isn't there? The stars flicker, letters from a dead god's alphabet. Wow. That just hints at so much mystery. Here's another poem for his partner Juno. This one is called Flannel Flowers for Juno. I'll never forget the first time I read this poem. It changed my headspace inside. It's one of the things that again has just given me the fire in the belly to want to pursue poetry above everything else. Flannel Flowers for Juno. We walk along a crumbling bush track, the full moon dropping through gums, down through the sparse limbs, their shredded bark hanging by balance, thinking in fragments. The air's damp and sweet. The sounds of the river are softened while you carry the rest of the world in your head, and I empty myself of memories, one word at a time. They sink behind us onto the floor of the bush. Your face shines with competence. Your hair flows. I hold your warm hand as we walk. It feels miraculously alive compared to my dry mouthings. Whatever we pass by seems very old. Twigs petrified into black glass crack under our feet. A tawny frogmouth looks at us from a dead branch, unblinking, immobile. I can't ask you for forgiveness. Words aren't part of this landscape. The weight of what I've done grinds away at my knees. The joints of my bones scrape away the word jelly. My head floats on the path beside you, its hair speckled pollen from flowering gums. You turn to gaze into a sandstone cave. Above the entrance, flannel flowers grow from the roots of an ancient fig, their blossoms closed against the dark. What a poem, what a sense of drama within this moment of resplendent beauty in the natural world. The sense of regret, of wanting forgiveness for something which is not really named. The vulnerability in this poem. The sense that, even in those most intimate, most important relationships, there is always the chance, isn't there, of brokenness, of something that could be unhealed. I find this an incredibly moving poem. It's so full of the natural world, of natural beauty. There is almost a baroque quality with many of these poems, aren't there? There's a real baroque quality of the imagery, of the alliterations, of the naming of flora and fauna. It's a beautiful poem. And amidst this incredible natural beauty on the river, once again, there's this sense of vulnerability, of brokenness, of wanting to be whole, not only in our relationship with the beautiful world around us, but in those intimate, interpersonal relationships. It's just such a beautiful poem. Robert Adamson, The Goldfinches of Bagdad. So what have I been able to do with this poetry? Like a lot of the poetry that I've been reading to you, some of the poetry in my first book, Sweetened in Coals, as I've already said in my last episode on Archie Emmons, this book is not informed at all by that confessional poetic, which all my recent work is informed by. This is much more a poetics of place, much more in communication with not only Archie Emmons, but with all the wonderful poetry that I've read here today. And there's lots of other Australian poets too, like Judith Wright, Rosemary Dobson, Gwen Harwood. Rosemary Dobson is a beautiful Canberra ACT poet, and again, there's this wonderful poem she wrote about sunflowers growing just north of Canberra, up on the Monaro Plains there, and it's a beautiful poem. I should track that down. I might do an episode later on Rosemary Dobson. She's a wonderful poet. This is a little bit what I've done with this. It's very much in communication with all the sort of poetry I've read today, and also going back to Archie Emmons. It's quite a traditional, quite a poetry that's more about, I suppose, reassurance, about conforming to the ways of the world, the routines of the world, our movement through wonderful natural places. This first poem, however, was also very much informed, going back to R.F. Brissenden. This poem was also very much informed by that sense of the damage that we sometimes do to these beautiful places. And this is very much a poem informed by a newer 21st century ecopoetics. My poem is called Save Behanna Gorge. Behanna Gorge is a beautiful natural granite gorge just south of Cairns, right up the top in far north Queensland. It's a beautiful place. Save Behanna Gorge. To town planners, the granite gorge traces like a wound across this scythed and hothouse landscape. Its water a sprawling spray storm in the wet, spitting and exposing steep barriers to advancement. Against the creek's current, tadpoles attach head first to rocks, and on the banks, burrowing frogs chorus in the leaf litter, while leeches stand erect on their sucker rear ends, longing for blood. Sometimes we see a cormorant or a heron, or hear the shrill staccato notes of a whistling kite circling treetops. You watch catfish guarding nests of stone as water rats slip through a strainer of flood debris. People come here to swim or spray graffiti. Sometimes, though, when I spend time in the gorge, all I hear is the zeroing in of mozzies, All I see is the spray of the torrent as I wait for curlew to call their drawn-out wailing, wee-ee. Often I'll just stare into the canopy as dragonflies manoeuvre their fabulous films in the flickering light. Or I'll watch the orb spider strung golden between trees and spotted with silver dew, or follow the line of swimming holes, lichen, fungus and fern, now proposed as a pipeline by the Cairns Water Corporation. So hopefully, that poem has really got that juxtaposition and that sting in that last line of urban development and of, threatened destruction. And I guess, again, like a lot of these poems today that I've read to you, there is that real baroque sonic sensibility of almost overdoing it with abundance, with variety. And this poem, is trying to really give a sense of the beauty of this particular place, and therefore to really heighten what it is that we are about to lose if we don't all stand up and fight for this place. Another poem that I've written here is called Bridal Falls. This was also set in far north Queensland. I was lucky enough, a decade ago or more, I lived up in Cairns, up in far north Queensland for a couple of years, running outdoor education and sport programs, mainly for First Australian kids. And while I was up there, I obviously did a lot of walking, and a lot of walking on my own too, as I recovered my strength between programs that I was running. So this is a poem called Bridal Falls. It's set just south of Cairns at a place called Gordonvale. There's this wonderful mountain in Gordonvale called Walsh's Pyramid. And it's also about Jarraga, which was the local First Australian word for the scrub hen, which was an important totem for many of the First Australians of this Gordonvale, southern Cairns region. Bridal Falls. To Walsh's Pyramid, that mountain mound of Jarraga, the scrub hen, we returned each year, the source of Bridal Falls. Torres Strait pigeons courting, deep ooms haunting the air. We talked through the wet seasons, thinking it meant something. The tropical heat sticking to our bodies, making clothes difficult, the UV extreme. Light in this glaring glasshouse grew as though on steroids, a stifling virility before decay. I had an affair with work, grew barbs, pretended, you bitterly waited. What should we have said? Fruit bats flew screaming, crash landing the canopy, disturbing neighbouring bats into noisy fights. One day, two great coastal taipans blocked our path. They were mating, coiling and uncoiling in ritualised wrestling, by necessity brief. We were on the edge of a sugar plantation, and whatever we feared rose up into the plover's plaintive cries. Sometimes aggression when nesting reminds us of what we share. Fruit bat lovers enveloped in wings, hanging. We're a hair's breadth from contentment, a field of sugar in exuberant, humid and suffocating air. I guess that's a poem that really returns to Robert Adamson, isn't it? To, a moment spent in a beautiful natural place with the chainsaw going outside, as you can appropriately hear. This is a poem about that moment spent in a beautiful natural place and of wanting to hang on to those intimate personal relationships. And sometimes we get a greater sense of wholeness from nature and natural world than we can from those personal relationships. And it's a poem again that is trying to balance stress and juxtaposition. And I think the best poetry of place now in the 21st century needs to be a poetry that is not only about in praise of, but it also needs to be a poetry that holds in balance, in check if you like, stresses and juxtapositions. So this is just some of my poetics of place. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Dr. Phil Reads to Write. I hope you're enjoying the journey with me. I will continue to post a new episode each Friday morning, Australian Eastern Standard Time. So, catch you on another dragon soon. Bye for now.